In the previous class, we have seen how to enclose our child component in our parent component is what we have seen. And post that, we have also talked about what is that naming convention that I need to use so that I can successfully embed a child LWC component in our parent component. Now in this session, we'll understand how do I pass information from my parent to the child, or in other words, how does the parent component communicate to the child component? So for that, let's go to our VS Code and see how can we do that. So just to recap, we have a parent demo LWC component and we have a child demo LWC component, which are acting as a parent and child that I've shown you in the previous screen. Now what I want is, I want a variable, I want a property, or I want a value that I want to pass from my parent to the child component. How do I do that? So if I want to pass something from my parent to the child should have the ability to capture it. For that reason, what I'll do, in my JS file of my child, I'll go ahead and create a property. So since it is coming from the parent component, I'll just name it as parent. I'll set it to blank initially. So this property, what I want is, I want this parent component to pass a value to this child component, which would set this property that I've created. In a pictorial format, if I go back to the PPT that we were referring to earlier, from the parent, I want to set a property that I have on the child. So that way, parent would be communicating something to the child. So since we have discussed this point, so the one that is enclosing the child is called parent, and the LWC component that has been enclosed in the parent component is called a child component. From the parent, I want to send some message to the child component. How do I do that? I've created a property called parent message, which would hold the value that is coming from the parent. Now, in order to pass a value to this property, parent should have access to it. Now, how do I expose this property so that the parent can access it? If I go back to the VS Code to show the component that I've added, so this is my child component. So that means there should be some mechanism for us that should be available so that I can pass that information to this child component. Now, if you see, the property that we have created is on the child. From the parent, I need to communicate it. How do we do that? That is where the concept of exposing the property as a public property comes into picture. What do I mean by that? Currently, this property is a private property. The scope of this property belongs to this component itself. Now, how do I expose this property so that the parent can access this value? Why does the parent need to access this value? So that it can communicate something to this one. So that way it can pass a value to this one. If I can pass a value from the parent to the child, that is where my communication of parent and child would be done. So from the parent, if I have the ability to set a value in this property, that is where parent is sending some information to this child component. That is what we are trying to do in this LWC component. Now, how do I expose this property to this parent? If you are familiar with your Aura component, that is where you might be wondering, yes, I can go ahead and set this value like this. I will take that property, paste it here, and set a value here. What is the value that I'm sending? This message is coming from parent. It is throwing an error that all the attribute name should be in a lowercase. Now, how do I do it? So I have done this kebab case styling. Let's see if that fixes that issue. So I'll just put a hyphen and then change that message M to small m. Now, if that error is gone, let's see if this is working or not. In order for me to show you that this message from the parent is being communicated to the child, this value has been set, what I need to do? I need to display that in the UI. How do I display an message on the UI, simply use that in a curly braces. So this is what I've done. In order to remove the confusion, also what I will do, I'll not declare this one. I'll not declare anything. So whatever that message is coming from here, it should go to that variable that I have defined on the child. Since this value has been declared here, it should be rendered with the message that I'm getting on the parent. So let's see if that is happening or not. Since I've made changes on the both the child and parent, so what I'll do, I'll deploy these changes. I've intentionally removed that value that I've set to blank on the child, just to avoid the confusion that if something is not rendering on the screen, if it is set to blank, we should not be an assumption that it is happening because of this property that we have set. Right, both components were deployed. Let's switch to our Salesforce org, do a hard refresh. Now, if you see, we were passing some value on the front end, but nothing got changed on the child component. So just for an indication, what I'll also do on the child component is, on the child component, I'll go ahead and add this line to indicate that this is the message coming from the parent. I'm just adding this extra line to indicate that there is a message that I have that I'm printing here to see if that is coming up or not. Right, from the screen that we are not able to figure out whether that message is being printed or not. So this indication would help us understand if the message is coming up, whether this line number 5 is executed or not. So let's go back to our Salesforce org, do a hard refresh to see if the changes are reflecting. If you see here on the child component, whatever the marker that we have added, that has been displaying that the message currently here has not been set. Now, why is it happening? The problem here is, even though we are setting this value is not accessed by the parent. Parent is not able to see this value. Even though the syntactically, whatever that we are writing is correct, parent is not able to set this value to this property. Now, how do I fix this one? That is where a concept of decorator comes into picture. What is the decorator that I'm talking about? I'm talking about a decorator called @API. Now, what exactly this decorator would do? Any property for which this decorator has been added, that property is considered as a public property. Now, decorator, in the literal meaning of it, we are trying to add something to the existing one to decorate it. Right? So that is what the decorator meaning is. Now we are adding @API to this property that we have already used, so that this LWC component can say that this parent message is now a public property. Now, what would be the advantage of that? The advantage that we would get just by doing this is your parent can start accessing this property and it can assign a value to it. In short, this parent can access this attribute and assign a value to it. So now if I go back to the child component and try to save it, it is throwing me an error saying that invalid decorator usage. And it is saying supported decorators are API, while and track should be imported from the LWC. At this point of time, we have only imported Lightning element. Whenever you are trying to use API, import them as well. All you need to do is put a comma and just say API. If you are using the API decorator, you should import that as well. Few things that we have done. First, for the property that we are assigning, we have added a decorator called @API. So by doing this to an property, it becomes a public property. All right. So once we have added that, Salesforce, the LWC was giving us an option saying that we need to import that decorator. So we have imported that decorator by writing a comma API, and those were the changes that we have done. This time I've made only changes on the child. I'm only deploying the child component here. My child component has been deployed. Let's go back to our Salesforce or do a hard refresh to see if this time the message from the parent has been communicated to the child here. So if you see here, this time we were able to get that message. Message from the parent has been communicated to the child. How did we do that? with the help of @API decorator to that property that we have assigned. So that is how you would be passing information from your parent to the child. In addition to the discussion of passing information from the parent to child, we have also looked at a concept of decorator related to API. Again, API adding to a property would make that property as a public property, which can be accessed from your parent component as well. That brings us to the end of this concept, where we have looked at how to pass the information from the parent to the child, and we have also discussed a property called @API.